Our story begins as the magistrate summons the city's finest butchers to dissect the carcass of a boar demon, but as they all approach with heavy, razor-sharp cleavers, he steps forward carrying nothing but a tiny blade that would barely be enough to kill a chicken. Everyone mocks him, naturally, thinking him a fool, especially since even the sharpest knives in the shop had only struck sparks against the beast without leaving a scratch. But what they didn't know was that he was capable of finding the demon's one and only weakness. In that moment, he stands before the massive corpse, holding his small, unassuming blade. His colleagues watch him with curiosity, and even the chief of the constables who captured the demon keeps a close eye on him. While the other butchers bring out all sorts of heavy tools, he carries only that short blade, looking quite out of place, to be honest. As he stands before the enormous carcass, he feels an intense, murderous aura striking his face. So this is what a monster feels like, he thinks to himself, feeling strangely lucky about the whole situation. Only a few days ago, he had been worried about how to find one, and now it was being served to him on a silver platter. In the very next instant, his gaze becomes sharp and focused. He raises the blade and rests it gently against the demon's neck. That murderous aura begins to gradually fade away from his vision. In his eyes, there is now only the exact method required to dismember this particular carcass. The blade descends, and a piece of meat, still imbued with energy, is cleanly removed. The lingering effect of that malignant aura is stripped away from the boar's body with surgical precision. The other butchers watch on, their eyes wide with complete disbelief. This young butcher was actually succeeding in carving up the monster. One piece of meat after another is separated under the skillful, rhythmic movement of his hands. If the others couldn't cut it, it was simply because their technique was mediocre, or so it seemed to him. But he, on the other hand, was mastering the art of butchery at an increasingly profound level. When he made the final cut, he put away his knife, and a sphere of blood-red meat was left floating in the air. The veins upon it pulsed faintly. It was the first time he had seen such a thing, and he had no idea what this bloody sphere actually was. But that wasn't the most important part. No, the most important thing was the glowing text that had just appeared before him. Butcher level 3, experience 0 out of 400. Surviving through butchery, he had awakened a new talent, weapon mastery of the Candy Kingdom. His learning speed for the saber techniques of the Candy Kingdom had just increased. The butcher class had finally broken its limit, reaching the 3rd level at last. He suppressed the joy in his heart and, without showing a hint of emotion, tucked away his small blade. After all, standing out too much always brings trouble, a universal rule, to be honest. While the red meat sphere continued to float, the chief of the constables was the first to react. Upon seeing it, he ordered in a stern voice for them to bring Officer Wong immediately. Observing the chief's reaction, he deduced that this sphere was no ordinary object. However, at the end of the day, he was still just a simple commoner. He had come solely to do the work of a butcher, nothing more. This didn't concern him at all, and shortly after, Officer Wong emerged from the main hall. He approached our protagonist, asking with a tone of surprise and clear superiority, "Was it you who butchered this boar demon?" He nodded calmly, confirming it was so, while Officer Wong wiped the sweat from his brow, sighing in relief. The chief of the constables, for his part, simply stood there in complete shock. His hand brushed lightly against the hilt of his sword, yet he remained silent, not uttering a single word. A constable stepped forward with a jet-black wooden box and carefully stored the blood-red meat sphere inside. Another officer approached him, holding 2 silver tails, and handed them over while waving his hand as if shooing a fly. "Take these and get out of here," he commanded. "The rest of you, leave as well." He tucked the 2 tails into his tunic and, taking his small knife, finally left the magistrate's compound. The demon was now fully butchered, and his class had successfully reached level 3, a productive day, all things considered. It was time to return home and put his new talent to the test. But shortly after he departed, Officer Wong leaned toward the chief constable and whispered, "That butcher, in a few days, get rid of him." We returned to his neighborhood, where, just as he reached his front door, the neighbor's door creaked open. Shin Shun poked his head out suspiciously, and upon seeing him, his small mustache gave a slight, nervous twitch. "Ah, you're back," Shun remarked, though he felt the man was acting quite strangely today, as if his return were somehow unexpected. Shin Shun sniffed the air subtly before suddenly retreating back into his house and slamming the door shut. He frowned, realizing the situation had become even more bizarre than he first thought. However, he was in a hurry to examine his new talent, so he didn't dwell on it and opened his own door. Just as he was about to step inside, Chun Chun's door opened once more, this time with the man holding a cloth bundle. He offered it, explaining he had bought it while selling wood in another county. They said it helped strengthen vital energy. He took it instinctively and began to unwrap the cloth. Inside lay a book, and on the cover, the title was clearly visible, Wind-Breaking Saber Technique. He weighed the manual in his hand and asked, "Old Chun, since when do you practice with sabers?" To him, Chin Chun seemed shrouded in mystery. After all, the man was supposed to be a simple coffin shop owner. Why, we might wonder, would the man suddenly hand him a martial arts manual out of the blue? After all, what kind of coffin shop owner spends his time training with a sword? Chin Chun let out a nervous laugh, explaining he'd heard the elders say that a demon's evil aura clings to any butcher who carves one up. He claimed the manual only cost him 2 copper coins, not worth much, perhaps, but supposedly good for a bit of luck. He arched an eyebrow in disbelief, but Qin Shun met his gaze with absolute, unwavering seriousness. The man insisted it was the truth, swearing he would never do anything to cause him harm. He rubbed his chin, staring intently at his neighbor. He knew that whenever the man lied, his mustache gave him away. "Old Chun, you're lying to me," he noted, a simple fact, given they had been neighbors long enough to know each other's tells. Qin Shun quickly smoothed his mustache with his finger and, with a sudden, violent slam of the door, retreated back into his house. "If you want to practice, then do it. It's for your own good," the man shouted from behind the safety of his door. A moment later, the neighbor's house fell into a heavy, absolute silence. He gripped the manual, considered the strange encounter for a moment, and finally stepped inside his own home. Whatever was going on with Qin Shun would have to wait. The priority now was to examine his new talent. Once inside, he focused his mind to analyze the skill, weapon mastery of the Kangi realm. With this power in his possession, any saber technique he attempted would surely yield unimaginable results. Reaching level 3 as a butcher had brought a strange enlightenment. It was as if he had suddenly become a veteran swordsman. The moment he gripped a weapon, a sense of absolute, natural familiarity began to course through his veins. After a moment's thought, he set his small knife aside and picked up the wind-breaking saber manual Qin Shun had provided. As he opened the worn pages, we see a series of illustrations laid out before him. The drawings were remarkably crude, to be honest, yet each one was carefully labeled with its own specific name. With just a quick glance through the pages, a sudden spark of understanding seemed to ignite within his mind. The images began to come to life before him in a matter of seconds, almost like a magic lantern show. We see the silhouette of a warrior training. He lowered his head, flipping the pages rapidly, immersed in absolute concentration. After a quarter of an hour, just as he turned the final page, the oil lamp on the table flickered sharply. He finally emerged from his trance and silently set the manual down. Before his very eyes, a dark smoke began to condense until it formed a clear line of text. He had observed the wind-breaking saber technique, and the Kangi realm mastery talent had been activated. The technique had been brought to perfection, and a thread of searing heat suddenly surged in his lower abdomen. Staring at the floating letters, he found himself completely dumbfounded. And who could blame him, really? The wind-breaking saber technique had reached the level of perfection. Kangi realm, Butcher level 3, experience, 0 out of 400. With the Kangi realm mastery talent active, he wondered if he had truly mastered the skill entirely already. His heart pounded with astonishment as he took the small blade by his side and began to swing it casually. As he moved, the cuts flowed with a lethal naturalness, generating powerful gusts of wind with every stroke. After a few seconds, he placed the weapon back onto the table. It seems he now had a completely new perspective on how his system actually functioned. This was far too powerful. It was clear that his abilities were not limited to peaceful professions. It was then that he noticed something else. At the bottom of the smoke, a line of smaller letters appeared. By studying the martial arts manual, he had the opportunity to unlock an entirely new class. The scholar class had been unlocked, and he was now a level 1 scholar. Experience, 0 out of 100. His reading speed had also increased slightly. A new class? He stood stunned for a second, and then a wave of pure joy washed over him. If it was a scholar class, he reasoned, then it must be tied directly to the act of reading. He picked up the manual once more, ready to continue his studies. But, much to his disappointment, the experience bar didn't budge at all. It appeared that books he had already read would no longer grant him any further experience. He set the book aside. With a new theory in mind, he decided he would visit the county library tomorrow. Seeing how late it had become, he thought for a moment and, following an old habit, hid his small blade under the pillow. He lay down in bed and closed his eyes while outside. The moon shone and the stars began to fade. Little by little, he drifted off to sleep. Time passed, and the early hours of the morning arrived. A gust of icy wind blew through, throwing the main door of his house wide open. A thick, heavy breathing began to resonate through the quiet air. Outside the window, the moon had vanished. The darkness of the night was now utterly oppressive. Heavy gasps came from the entrance, where a massive boar demon blocked the doorway, cutting off every trace of light. But just as it took its first step into the room, its hoof seemed to trip over something. Less than 5 inches from the floor, an invisible fishing line had been tied to a small bell. The line tightened and snapped, and the bell hit the floor, releasing a sharp chime that tore through the deathly silence. The demon paused for a single heartbeat and then began to slowly approach his bed. Its heavy breathing grew louder, sounding like a death knell ringing in the middle of the night. He lay there with his back to the shadow, his face hidden from the creature's view. The beast drew closer and closer until it finally raised its disgusting claw and extended it toward his back. Right at that instant, he performed a quick roll, jumping nimbly from the bed and running at full speed toward the door. We see that he had actually woken up the very second that unexpected visitor crossed the threshold. That sound trap was his own. He had always been extremely cautious, though he never truly imagined someone would sneak in through the dark. The moment he leaped from the bed, he was able to see the intruder's face with terrifying clarity. It was a demon, a boar demon, and he realized that when a butcher dismembers a monster, the curse and murderous aura cling to him. The words of Chun Chun resonated in his mind, and without hesitating for a second, he ran to make his escape. But just as he was about to reach the exit, the boar launched a brutal kick directly toward him. A roar of wind tore through the air with a violence that was, to be honest, absolutely deafening. In that critical moment, he quickly crossed both arms over his chest to protect himself. A bestial force was transmitted through his arms, shaking every single bone in his body. He felt his limbs go numb as he was sent flying backward, slamming hard against the wall before coming to a stop. He spat out a mouthful of warm blood, thinking to himself that his luck was truly miserable. Chun Chun had warned him, after all, and here he was facing death in the form of a beast. He gripped the small blade in his hand with all his might and wiped the blood from his lips. "This has nothing to do with me. I'm just a butcher," he shouted in a desperate attempt to reason with it. The beast, which we now see is a female demon, snorted violently in response. 2 streams of thick, white vapor shot out from her snout, filling the small room. "You carry the scent of my husband," she growled, "and I am going to avenge his death." Her husband? It all made sense now. It turned out the monster he had butchered had a partner. By mutilating the corpse, the scent of her partner's blood had truly become ingrained in him. "This is the work of the constables," he shouted while leaning against the wall, insisting he wasn't to blame. The creature licked her parched lips, and a bloodthirsty light gleamed in her eyes. She raised her gigantic hand, as large as a palm leaf fan, aiming directly at his head and creating a gale in its wake. Seeing that enormous claw about to crush him, a burning rage suddenly erupted deep inside him. It was the officers who had killed her husband. After all, he had only followed the order to butcher him. But it was evident the beast only wanted to use this as an excuse to devour him alive. Fine then, if that was how she wanted to play, he decided they would play. He gritted his teeth, and in his mind, the image of those training silhouettes appeared once more. As she moved like a flash of lightning, his body executed the wind-breaking technique out of pure instinct. That current of heat within him flowed through his arms and straight into the blade of his weapon. The knife sliced through the air, triggering a violent sonic explosion. The demon's massive claw froze mid-trajectory as a look of absolute disbelief filled her bloodshot eyes. His blade tore through her shoulder and swept downward, stopping right in the center of her chest. The burning heat of the blade penetrated the beast's interior, and her heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. Crash! A dull, bone-chilling sound echoed, sounding extremely clear in the middle of the darkness. The beast's massive body collapsed heavily onto the floor, twitching for a few moments before going completely still. He leaned against the wall to stand up, cleaning the blood from his blade by rubbing it against the dead boar's fur. A total wild beast, he thought, and yet she was speaking with human manners. How disgusting. And yet, the handle of his weapon still retained a lingering trace of heat. He had never imagined that the power of this technique would prove to be so lethal. That mysterious energy seemed to empower the strike, elevating the wind-breaking technique to an entirely new level of lethality. Suddenly, noises echoed from outside, and he turned his attention toward the street. There, standing in the threshold of his shattered door, Chun Chun appeared. Chun Chun, clutching a short sword, had come running all the way to the house. But when he saw the massive corpse of the demon sprawled on the floor, his entire face transformed into a mask of pure shock. He wondered if the young man had truly mastered the technique, having rushed over with his sword drawn to save him just moments ago. He never imagined that, before he could even get close, the demon would have already been sliced in half with a single blow. From his posture, it was perfectly evident that he had used the wind-breaking technique. But, to be honest, hadn't he just given it to him this very afternoon? And he had mastered it by nightfall? Chun Chun's gaze was now a complex mixture of terror and respect. Keeping his eyes calm, he simply ordered the man to close the door. Instinctively, Chun Chun entered the house and locked the door behind him. But the moment he did, he felt strange. Why was he suddenly obeying so meekly? He turned to look at him, his mustache trembling again, his expression frozen in utter disbelief. We see him crouching on the floor, nimbly dismembering the fresh corpse of the beast. When asked what he was doing, he replied it was his job as a butcher, though Chun Chun wondered why he had to do it right now. It was a giant monster, after all. Did he really expect him to just let it rot in the middle of his living room? Chun Chun was left speechless, feeling that the young man was 100 times colder and more calculating than he appeared. To be attacked by a demon at dawn, kill it in one stroke, and then, with total indifference, begin to dissect it, which tells you everything you need to know. What kind of ordinary citizen could possibly do that? From the first cut to the very last, it took him barely the time it takes to burn 2 incense sticks. After moving the sliced meat to his kitchen, he found something else among the remains, another red fleshy sphere, identical to the one he saw earlier in the magistrate's office. He thought about it for a moment, then wrapped it in a cloth and hid it away in a secret corner. Once he had finished cleaning up the scene, he finally stepped out of the kitchen. We see that Chun Chun was still standing there, in the exact same spot, completely paralyzed. He poured himself a glass of water and asked, "Old Chun, who are you really? If he only had suspicions before, he was now completely certain that this man was no ordinary neighbor. After all, what kind of funeral home owner heads out in the middle of the night armed with a sharpened saber? Chin Shun coughed awkwardly and looked away, claiming he had only heard loud noises and feared bandits were breaking in. The young man simply stared fixedly into his eyes, without saying a single word. Slowly, he began to lift the sharpened blade he had resting by his side. Since he had been dragged into this deadly mess, he felt he had no choice but to be ruthless and see things through to the end. Alberto's silent threat worked. Chun Chun's mouth trembled as he blurted out that he was an undercover agent for the Demon House Division. He explained he was hiding there to find proof that the magistrate and his officials were in league with the monsters. The man knew perfectly well that if he didn't confess the truth, the butcher would be more than willing to use that knife on him. Besides, just a few moments ago, a new idea had crossed his mind. Our protagonist was supposed to be a simple commoner, yet in a single afternoon, he had mastered the wind-breaking technique to a lethal degree. Without a doubt, he possessed a divine and innate talent for martial cultivation. His job as a spy was never easy, and having such a deadly and cold ally in the county would be an invaluable advantage. His hand, still gripping the weapon tightly, paused for a second. The local government allied with demons? Although he had heard of the legendary division tasked with exterminating heresy, why would the authorities themselves make a pact with them? Chin Chun rubbed the right side of his mustache with his index finger and confessed that, for now, it was only a suspicion. However, the extermination records in this county were very strange, to say the least. Every so often, a person would die brutally, yet curiously, the government always managed to kill the responsible demon immediately afterward. The Demon House headquarters was spread thin and couldn't send a full squad, which is why he had to step into action alone. His job was to be the eyes and ears of the division. Meanwhile, in the shadows, our protagonist arched an eyebrow, intrigued. Then why did you try to help me? He asked. If he was truly a spy, he should have avoided exposing himself at all costs. Just moments ago, the man had arrived armed and ready to save him, risking his entire cover in the process. Chin Chun struck his chest with pride and declared that the men of their division swore to annihilate monsters and protect civilians. You are a civilian, and that is all that matters, he said. Alberto took another sip of water, never once looking away. He didn't know how much truth lay in those noble words, but if the man really was a spy for that powerful secret organization, killing him now would be a terrible mistake. This was especially true knowing he was here investigating the governor. A corrupt government forging dark alliances, creating artificial chaos and sacrificing innocents just to hunt irrelevant demons and pretend they were doing their jobs. Thinking about it, it was exactly the kind of thing those low-life politicians would definitely do. He then asked about the manual he had been given, wondering if it was actually genuine. Chun Chun nodded quickly, assuring him it was, though he clarified it didn't belong to the division. If he were to pass the state's martial secrets to a civilian, they would surely have his head for it. It was a technique inherited from his own family. Chin Chun explained the strict martial laws, and the young man understood them perfectly. We must remember that in this world, cultivation techniques were considered invaluable treasures. If someone taught them without permission, in the best-case scenario, the consequences would be dire. They would destroy his cultivation, and in the worst-case scenario, he would be executed in public. When he handed you the book, he never for a moment imagined you could actually master it. He only hoped it would help you defend yourself for a few seconds and escape with your life. He never imagined that you would bring that technique to absolute perfection in a single night. Alberto remained in absolute silence. To be honest, everything that had happened tonight felt far too absurd and surreal. He had stumbled into a dark underworld he knew nothing about, and his mind needed to process all this information at once. Seeing that the young man was lost in thought, Chin Chun looked around the room with extreme caution. Walking on tiptoe, he leaned in close to Alberto's side and whispered, "Hey, are you going to use that blood essence? If you don't want it, why not give it to me?" Blood essence. Immediately, Alberto remembered that disgusting, throbbing sphere of flesh. Rubbing his mustache anxiously, a nervous habit, it seemed, Chin Chun continued. For cultivators of the Kangi realm, that essence is an incalculable treasure for leveling up. Noticing his desperation, Alberto sensed that the object was likely worth a small fortune. Feigning a calm he didn't quite feel, he asked what exactly that essence was. Chin Chun glanced toward the kitchen with pure greed and began to explain. Demons also meditate and accumulate power, and those overflowing with massive, violent energy condense it into a blood essence. By fusing that essence with one's own chi, it acts as a perfect tonic. It can save a cultivator decades of hard training. Now, finally, the situation was becoming clear. In short, that ball of meat was a vital resource for the martial arts. Chin Chun licked his lips in pure anxiety, knowing Alberto didn't have the necessary meditation techniques. If you try to consume it without the correct mental method, that raw energy will make your organs explode and you will die. It's better if you give it to me. If I become stronger, I'll be able to protect you much better. Alberto evaluated him for a second and then firmly shook his head. At any other time, he might have given it away without a second thought. But not now. He was already neck-deep in this war against monsters. Although he lacked a spiritual method to refine the essence, he knew that in this deadly hunt, every resource was worth its weight in gold. He had to keep it as an ace up his sleeve, especially since he had reincarnated into this world so recently and nearly lost his life tonight. With a system in his favor and having finally awakened his first divine talent, he knew his primary duty was simply to stay alive. He would keep that blood essence at all costs. Surely, it would save his skin in the future. Upon hearing this refusal, Qin Chun's eyes filled with a sense of deep disappointment. But he didn't insist further. Quickly changing the subject, he offered a warning. That boar hunted you down because of your work as a butcher. Now that you've killed it, the immediate danger has passed. But still, do not lower your guard, and hide that essence well. Make sure no one sees it. Alberto nodded, accepting the advice. Qin Chun stood up, turned around, and walked heavily toward the exit. Before leaving, he cast one last glance back and announced he was going. Remember, not a word about my identity. I won't hurt you, but if you open your mouth, the entire division will come for your head. Behind that apparent threat, Alberto sensed the man was only trying to protect and warn him. We see him watch as the man disappears into the darkness, and he immediately closes the entrance. He fixed his shattered door as best he could, reset the invisible tripwire on the floor, and finally sat on the edge of the bed with his knife within reach. The world was rotting, monsters roamed free, and his only chance of survival was to master that strange system. He remembered that he had unlocked the scholar class, which fortunately didn't require much experience to level up. His plan was clear. Tomorrow he would go to the county library to immerse himself in reading and earn those points. With that resolution in mind, he managed to fall asleep in the middle of that bloody night, clutching his weapon tightly. As the sun rose, he woke up early, washed himself quickly, and headed out into the street. While he was heading toward the great library, he heard a massive commotion long before he actually arrived. We see him sharpen his gaze as he notices an immense crowd of scholars in neat robes blocking the entrance. They were huddled together, forming an impenetrable human barrier, shouting and pushing as if hell itself were breaking loose inside. Intrigued, he pushed through them and saw a young man in yellow work clothes, with a long saber, mercilessly beating a student. The student, bruised and bloodied, was completely unable to defend himself against the assault. Although the other students watched the beating, they were so intimidated by the armed man's ferocity that none dared to intervene. The man with the saber stepped on the student's back and spat on the ground, calling him useless trash for insulting his sect. He threatened to knock out all the student's teeth, and it seemed the man, Saw, was far from finished. The man named Saw continued to stomp on the student's back, even spitting on the back of his neck. The student, with a broken nose and a swollen face, tried to crawl away, but it was a futile effort. The observing students whispered among themselves, wondering why on earth he had messed with the River Saber sect. Word was that the woman he loved had married a disciple of that very sect. And, unable to bear the heartbreak, he had written a poem specifically to insult them. They all agreed he was finished. You simply don't cross the River Saber sect and expect a happy ending. His good days were over, though someone mentioned they had already notified the authorities. The constables would arrive soon. Upon hearing this, we see that he finally understood exactly what was happening. There were several factions surrounding Din County, and the River Saber sect was certainly one of the most prominent. It was even said that the Liao sect respected them deeply, a rare thing in these parts. As for the exact reason, no one really knew. He decided not to intervene, choosing instead to watch from the sidelines. Although everyone claimed the authorities had been called, the man named Saw continued his assault without a care in the world. The student had very little breath left in him. At that precise moment, heavy footsteps were heard approaching from a distance. Several constables came running toward the scene and immediately moved to restrain the man named Saw. Saw shook them off roughly, demanding to know what they were doing and telling them not to interfere in Saw Hinseng's business. He reminded them that even their magistrate had to treat his sect leader as a guest of honor. The lead constable, a man with the face of a mouse and the eyes of a thief, hurried to whisper in Saw Hinseng's ear. He suggested that since they were all on the same side and the beating was already done, it was best to leave it be. While he spoke, he gave a subtle wink to the constable standing right beside him. That man stepped forward, hauled the student up, and delivered a sharp slap across his face. He accused the young man, Scholar Eureka, of writing subversive poems against the peace. He ordered him to be imprisoned for 3 days, and seeing this, Saw Hinseng realized it wasn't wise to keep the assault going. Besides, he had already vented his anger, so he decided to keep his mouth shut for once. The lead constable, wearing a greasy smile, patted Saw Hinseng on the shoulder in a friendly manner. He invited Brother Saw to the local brothel, suggesting it was time for him to relax after his hard work. Saw Hinseng's eyes lit up instantly as he nodded, praising the man for knowing exactly how to handle things. He declared that, just this once, he would be magnanimous and let this pathetic excuse for a scholar go. A little later, we see the constables marching away alongside Saw Hinseng. The students who remained clenched their fists, desperate to intervene, but not daring to utter a single word. They had seen exactly what happened and knew all too well that the constables and Saw Hinseng were in league together. But since they hadn't passed the imperial exams, they were merely common citizens who didn't dare to interfere. They were absolutely furious, yet they had nowhere to vent their mounting frustration. Gradually, led by a few of the older students, the crowd began to disperse into the streets. He watched the constables leave, and once the crowd cleared, he followed his original plan and entered the bookstore. To him, what had just occurred was nothing more than a minor incident in a long day. He hadn't forgotten his purpose here, and as for that student, being locked up for a few days to save his life was actually a stroke of luck. Upon entering the bookstore, the first thing we see are rows upon rows of towering bookshelves. Although this Clearbreeze bookstore was only a branch, the Emperor's current focus on both martial arts and literature meant the place had everything. His appearance was quite different from that of a typical student, but he didn't draw much unwanted attention. The bookstore, as it turned out, allowed students to read the collection for free. If they wanted to take a book home, however, they were required to either rent it or buy it outright. Most of the students visiting at this hour were just like him, the type who preferred to read for free. He walked straight toward a shelf, picked up a volume, and began to leaf through it casually. Although his movements seemed relaxed, his gaze was filled with an intense, quiet concentration. He knew that he could only increase his skill level by practicing with his undivided attention. After he had been reading for a while, a familiar line of text floated before his eyes. Student +1. As he suspected, the student class requires reading books to actually function. He gripped the book tightly, thinking to himself as he processed this new information. The current situation aligned perfectly with what he had imagined would happen. He simply needed to keep reading to increase his skill level. Having achieved his immediate goal, he continued to scan the pages with his eyes. He focused intently, noticing that the students around him were also reading with deep concentration. Time flew by, and no one bothered him in the bookstore until the sky began to take on the colors of sunset. It was then that he finally stopped. Student level 0. 50%. His reading speed had increased just a little bit. From morning until late afternoon, his skill level had risen by 50 points. At this rate, he would likely reach the first full level by tomorrow. But he was in no hurry. After being stuck at level 3 of the butcher class for so long, he had learned to survive regardless. Now, a single day seemed like a very short time indeed. The bookstore was about to close, so he decided he would simply return the next morning. He could have paid to rent or buy the book to continue at home, but he didn't think that was a particularly good idea. First, he needed to find a balance. In this chaotic environment, one must keep a clear head. Second, a butcher carrying a book home would surely bring trouble if someone with bad intentions spotted him. Hiding his true abilities, as we know, is the absolute key to survival. He returned the book to the shelf and began his walk back home. The sky glowed with the setting sun, and the smoke from evening kitchens rose all around him. Just as he was about to reach the street where he lived, the sunset faded and darkness fell silently. The faint moonlight bathed the street, serving as the only source of illumination. He walked through the alley with his hand resting casually on his waist. Once he passed through this alley, he would be home. It had been a productive day, all things considered. To focus on increasing his skill level, he hadn't even opened the butcher shop. Fortunately, his time working as a butcher had left him with a decent amount of savings. Closing for a few days wouldn't make him starve, and he certainly knew how to prioritize. His first goal was simple: take the student class to its maximum level. Suddenly, the sound of approaching footsteps interrupted his thoughts. He looked toward the sound and saw a drunken man clutching a jug of wine, stumbling toward him. Under the pale moonlight, he recognized the face and felt a frown tugging at his brow. Saw Hinseng had just left the Din County brothel, still carrying wine he had stolen from the place. He drank as he walked, muttering bitterly to himself. That Velucho student, how dare he write poems insulting the River Saber sect? With skin that thin, he's going to suffer quite a bit in prison, which was to be expected, really. How pathetic. We stole his childhood sweetheart, and now she belongs to us. And he still thinks he's superior when he clearly isn't. How pathetic. Ha ha ha. Saw Hinseng babbled, completely intoxicated. Seeing him, our butcher slowed his pace and moved to pass by him quietly. He couldn't quite hear what the man was saying, and he had no desire to look for trouble. But as they crossed paths, Saw Hinseng looked at him by instinct, and just as he was about to turn away, he spotted the sharp knife at his waist. He stood there, lost in thought. It wasn't until our butcher disappeared down the street that Saw Hinseng finally reacted, the shock clearing half his drunken stupor. That guy looks like he knows how to use a knife, he muttered, but he doesn't look like a simple farmer. Could he have stumbled upon some secret technique? Saw Hinseng was absolutely certain of what he had just seen. The River Saber sect were experts in blade techniques, and he, to be fair, was one of their most promising disciples. That man who had just walked past him, though he appeared to be an ordinary fellow, clearly practiced with the blade. It was a subtle detail, something only those who truly practiced the art of the saber could perceive. He must have acquired some secret technique by pure, dumb luck. With just one look, he realized the man dressed like a common villager and lacked the air of someone belonging to the martial arts world. If he truly possessed a saber manual, it would be a complete waste not to take it from him. Greed quickly took hold of Saw Hinseng. Only someone in his position knew just how precious cultivation techniques really were. Even though he was a standout talent within the River Saber sect, he was still considered an outsider. If he wanted more benefits, he needed to bring great merits to the sect, and he needed them soon. And now, he believed the perfect opportunity was standing right before his eyes. Fueled by alcohol, Saw Hinsing cast all caution aside and, as if possessed by a demon, followed our butcher into the darkness of the alley. Upon arriving home, our butcher hung the small bells back on the door, a simple but necessary precaution. His plan was straightforward: sleep early, recover his energy, and return to the bookstore the following morning. When he arrived, he noticed that Chun Chun's house was completely dark. He assumed the man hadn't returned yet. Investigating cases for the Demon Suppression Division was his duty, and since the funeral home was in his name, no one cared if he stayed out. After tidying up his things, he finally prepared himself for a well-deserved rest. It was already quite late when, suddenly, a sharp knock at the door shattered the silence of the night. He frowned slightly and looked toward the door, but he didn't offer a single word in response. Instead, he gripped his sharp butcher's knife and hid himself carefully behind the doorframe. Ever since that messy incident with the pig demon, he had become far more cautious, and who could blame him, really? In all of Ding County, the only person he could truly call an acquaintance was Chin Chan. If it were him, he would have spoken upon arrival. If the visitor remained silent, then it was someone else entirely. And we all know that a silent visit at such a late hour usually means only one thing: trouble. The room fell into a heavy, complete silence as he waited. The knocking continued for a few moments longer, and then, just as suddenly as it started, it ceased. Under the pale moonlight, the cold glint of a steel blade slipped through the crack in the door. He narrowed his eyes, recognizing it as a saber. The blade slid upward slowly until it touched the door bolt. It began to saw back and forth until the latch gave way, allowing a young man to creep inside stealthily. But he had barely taken a single step before he tripped over the small bells placed on the floor. Ding, ling, ling. In the oppressive darkness of the room, the sound of those bells was absolutely deafening. Saw Hinseng, who had been so focused on his surroundings, was caught completely off guard by the noise. And before he could even begin to react, he felt a sudden, sharp rush of wind at his back. Our butcher had attacked. He didn't care who it was, for a midnight intrusion meant an unwelcome guest. To protect himself, he chose to act. The knife whistled through the air, aimed straight for Saw Hinseng's heart. If that strike found its mark, to be honest, not even the gods themselves would be able to save him. The butcher poured his will into the blade, and the sound of the cutting air broke Saw Hinseng into a cold sweat. In a moment of pure survival instinct, he swung his saber behind his back, blocking the attack just in time. The force of the impact was brutal. Saw Hinseng staggered back, retreating a few steps to regain his balance, and turned to face our butcher. Deep down, he felt he had confirmed his suspicions. The man only knew how to handle a knife, but lacked any internal cultivation techniques. To him, the butcher was just a lucky amateur, and Saw Hinseng's eyes began to gleam with pure, unadulterated greed. He raised his saber high, preparing to split the man in two without a second thought. He claimed that secret technique as his own, declaring that if the butcher was to die by his water shadow saber today, he should at least know his killer. Saw Hinseng licked his lips, let out a sinister laugh, and concentrated his inner energy for the final blow. He launched a direct slash at the butcher's neck, the blade of his saber appearing to distort as if covered in flowing water. We should note that the River Saber sect was famous for this specific water shadow technique. When attacking, the energy would transform into a fluid state, designed to trap and entangle the enemy's weapon. An ordinary, inexperienced fighter would try to block the attack, only to have their weapon caught in the water, leaving them at the attacker's mercy. Saw Hinseng was already imagining the glorious moment he would finally get his hands on that saber manual. But just then, the butcher's knife became even faster, moving with a speed that completely anticipated the strike. With a single, precise slash from right to left, he cut straight through Saw Hinseng's throat. A thin, icy red line appeared on Saw Hinseng's neck, marking the end of his ambitions. By sheer reflex, Saw Hinseng reached for his throat, and upon looking at his hand, he saw it was soaked in fresh blood. His throat was utterly destroyed, and his voice now sounded like nothing more than a broken bellows. Without changing his expression at all, and with one quick, decisive movement, the butcher drove the knife into Saw Hinseng's chest. Blood splattered across the floor. Under the pale moonlight, Saw Hinseng saw that impassive face and felt a deep, chilling terror. He had chosen the wrong prey, realizing too late that while the butcher lacked internal cultivation, his mastery of the blade was far beyond basic. Internal techniques are essential, of course, but raw combat skill is every bit as important in a fight for survival. Those who possess only raw strength without skill will find themselves stuck at the Yakulto level forever. And Saw Hinseng, as we can see, was barely at the Yakulto level himself. His saber technique was basic, while the butcher's mastery of the blade was nothing short of perfect. How could he possibly win? Our butcher simply maintained his cold, impassive expression. He raised his foot and delivered a sharp kick to Saw Hinseng's abdomen. The body slid off the knife's blade, rolled a couple of times across the ground, and finally stopped moving. He knelt down, confirmed the man was dead, and used the dead man's own clothes to wipe the blood from his knife. It was an old habit from his days as a butcher. After every slaughter, he always cleaned his tools. After all, that blade is what puts food on the table, and he realized, to be honest, that this wasn't so different from killing a pig. He He felt he had finally adapted to this new life, or at the very least, he no longer felt the urge to vomit. Once the blade was clean, he looked at the corpse on the ground, thought for a moment, and began to search it. After a brief search, he discovered a book hidden against Sa Hinseng's chest. By the glow of the moon and his small oil lamp, he was able to make out the title. It was the Frost Origin Internal Cultivation Technique, and as he opened it, lines of text began to appear before his eyes. He had only read a few words before the content gripped his attention completely. Under the dim light of the lamp, he immersed himself in the reading with total, unwavering concentration. By the time he finished the entire book, his skill level as a student had already increased. But the level increase wasn't the important part. What truly mattered was the content itself. Just as he had suspected, this book was a genuine manual for internal cultivation. It was known as the Frost Origin Internal Cultivation Technique, and it changed everything. By cultivating it, the energy he formed would take on an icy nature, capable of slowing down an opponent's movements or even causing frostbite damage. According to the book, this was a technique of the Yakulto level, a rare find indeed. His eyes sparkled with genuine excitement. It was exactly what he needed to survive. It seemed Sa Hinseng turned out to be a rather helpful fellow after all, in his own way. This was the missing piece, as Qin Shun had warned him that both internal and combat techniques were incredibly valuable. Of course, practicing someone else's technique carried a risk. If he were caught, they would undoubtedly seek a bloody revenge. But he had no choice, for in these chaotic times with no one to back him, passing up such an opportunity would be a sin. He immediately sat down with his legs crossed and began to circulate his energy, following the paths written in the manual. As the book stated, true cultivation is not something achieved overnight, a frustrating reality for many. The most important part of practicing this specific technique was successfully generating that icy essence. Once he managed that, he would have mastered the basics of the craft. And upon reaching the maximum level, that frost could coat his weapons and destroy his enemies from the inside out. After the time it takes for an incense stick to burn out, he opened his eyes, and a look of disappointment crossed his face. He wondered if he simply lacked the talent for cultivation, despite the manual's very clear instructions. If one could increase their energy even slightly in that time, it meant they were fit to cultivate the technique. But if nothing happened during that window, then, quite simply, they did not possess the gift. He was certain that his internal energy hadn't increased in the slightest. It hadn't even stirred. That tiny thread of energy he possessed was merely what he had started with. But now, after attempting to cultivate for a good while, he had achieved absolutely nothing. He realized he lacked the natural talent, which felt like standing before a mountain of treasure without a key to the door. He felt a wave of frustration, but he quickly pushed that feeling aside and hid it well. After thinking it over for a moment, he brought out a brazier and burned the Frost Origin manual. He had already memorized every word, and keeping the book would only invite unnecessary trouble. Safety first, as they say. As for his apparent lack of talent, he didn't let it bother him. His true advantage wasn't found in traditional internal cultivation techniques, but in his unique leveling skill. His first priority was to raise his student class to level 3. He decided this was the best way to obtain innate talent, and with that in mind, his gaze returned to the corpse. Next, he grabbed Zhao Hinseng and dragged him toward the backyard as if he were nothing more than a slaughtered pig. He took up his iron shovel, and before long, he had dug a hole, tossed the body inside, and buried it. Zhao Hinseng was no ordinary man. His sect was so powerful that even the local authorities treated them with respect. Having killed him, he had no desire for trouble and knew he needed to erase every single trace. After the burial was complete, he set to work cleaning the bloodstains from the house. He returned the small bells to their rightful places and lay down to sleep with his clothes still on. He had to return to the bookstore the next morning, so he needed to get some proper rest. As for the act of killing a man, well, in these chaotic times, people seem to die every single day. No one would find him easily, and if they did, he would simply worry about that when the time came. The following day, after finishing his meal, we see him returning to the bookstore. The owner of the Clear Breeze bookstore didn't seem at all surprised to see him again. Many people visited his shop, even members of various factions, hoping they might stumble upon some forgotten manual. But cultivation techniques are incredibly valuable. They aren't exactly the sort of thing you find just lying around. Since the owner didn't seem to mind his presence, he felt a bit more at ease. He found himself a quiet corner, picked up a book, and began to read. Thanks to his class bonus, he was able to read at an impressive speed. Combined with his reading of the Frost Origin manual the night before, his proficiency level had already begun to rise. This time, he didn't even have to wait until the afternoon for his proficiency bar to fill up completely. Student level 1, 100%. His reading speed increased just a little bit more. The requirements to level up were simple enough. He just needed to read 3 common books. Upon reaching the maximum, new conditions appeared before him. Once he fulfilled them, he would finally be able to advance his level. The conditions to move from level 1 to level 2 were, to be honest, quite reasonable. It was still early, so he picked up another book and continued his studies. He kept reading until the afternoon arrived, at which point he finally set the book down. Student level 2, 0%. His reading speed had increased once again. Level 2. After finishing 3 full books, he ascended without any issues whatsoever. It took him 2 days to reach level 2, and he calculated that level 3 would take another 4. He had read enough for one day. Though he wanted his innate talent quickly, he knew better than to force things. Leaving the bookstore behind, we see him making his way back home. As he approached his door, he noticed that Captain Zend and his guards had already arrived at his house. "The butcher Inan lives here," a guard said, stepping forward with a respectful bow. "Sir, we have confirmed it. Inan lives in this place, but for some reason, he isn't here today." Captain Zend frowns in confusion. "He isn't dead after all." The guard nods, confirming that they had seen him on the street just a short while ago. Indeed, he is still alive. Zend drums his fingers on the hilt of his saber, overcome by a strange sensation. He had received orders to bring silver to compensate the family for Inan's death, but now it turns out he is still breathing. The pig demon had an accomplice, and knowing the bloodthirsty nature of demons, Inan should have been tainted with that beast's essence. By all accounts, he should have become the primary target for their vengeance. How is it possible that he is still alive? Captain Zend couldn't understand it, but he decided to stay and wait with his men anyway. This was a mission personally assigned by Officer Wong, and as captain of Ding County, he couldn't take the task lightly. Though, to be perfectly honest, what he wanted most was to see for himself what on earth had happened to the man. A short time later, a figure emerged from the darkness of the street. Recognizing Inan's face, the captain approached him immediately. He asked if anything strange had been noticed lately, though Inan had already spotted the guards from a distance. He shook his head. "Nothing unusual has happened," he claimed. "Sir Zend, what brings you here?" After a moment's hesitation, he decided to approach them. The current situation is far too unstable, and if the guards have come looking for him, he knows he must deal with them somehow. Captain Zend arches an eyebrow and gives his response. "Nothing in particular," he says. "It's just that demons have been causing quite a bit of havoc lately. I have orders to search the area. Open the door and let me take a look inside." After saying this, he scrutinizes the butcher with a sharp, piercing gaze. He nods and steps forward to open the door, carefully avoiding any movement that might give him away. The captain makes a gesture, ordering his men to enter while he remains outside to keep watch. Without anyone noticing, Inan's hand grips the hilt of his knife firmly. Whether it was the blood essence or the pig demon's corpse, he had made sure to hide everything perfectly. Xiao Henseng's body is buried deep underground, and to leave no trace, he covered the fresh soil with old earth, just as he intended. After the time it takes for an incense stick to burn, the guards emerge, shaking their heads. They have found absolutely nothing. Captain Zend's hand, which had been clutching his saber, relaxes subtly. "Retreat." The captain gives the signal and prepares to leave with his men. Just as Inan is about to enter his house, a guard arrives running desperately, nearly tripping when he sees the captain. "Sir, we bring bad news. Men from the Ideo sect have arrived. They say one of their disciples has disappeared, and he was carrying a copy of the sect's core technique. They are waiting in the main hall." The captain stands stunned for a second, his face turning pale. "We must return to the magistrate's office immediately." In a matter of seconds, Zend and his guards vanish down the street. Hearing the guard's words, Inan focuses his mind, realizing that things are spiraling out of control. No one knows better than he does exactly who that sect is looking for. That man is currently resting in his backyard, buried several meters underground. His only way out now is to raise his scholar class to the 3rd level as quickly as possible, which will take him to the guard's headquarters. And there, he will see if that new talent is of any use to him. With that thought in mind, he enters his house. Before closing the door, he glances toward Chin Chun's home. It remains in darkness, and he has no idea where she might have gone. And so, the last few days have passed in complete and utter tranquility. Faithful to his routine, he would eat and then lock himself away in the bookstore until the 4th day finally arrived. There, in the peace of the shop, we see him set down the book he had been reading. A wisp of smoke materializes before his eyes, condensing into clear text, Scholar, Level 2. And immediately, the words appear, Condition fulfilled. He assumed this had everything to do with the mental and saber technique manuals he had been reading lately. In the end, that saved him an endless amount of trouble. If he were forced to find a Sanji stage tome right now, he never would. This system was proving to be quite considerate. To be honest, almost suspiciously so. The smoke swirls once more, forging a new message. Scholar, Level 3. 0 out of 400. Reading speed slightly increased. Talent acquired. Mastery in the comprehension of Sanji mental techniques. He stares at the floating words with an expressionless face, but deep down, his heart is racing with euphoria. Lately, besides reading, he had been practicing the N1 mental technique every night, but with disappointing results. He was starting to believe that he simply had no talent for it whatsoever. But with this new mastery, he was certain his training would take a monumental leap forward. With that thought in mind, he hurried to put the book back on the shelf and rushed home. By then, the sky was already stained with the deep colors of sunset. He lit the oil lamp, sat cross-legged, and began to channel energy along the paths of the N1 technique, repeating the cycle over and over. As soon as the energy began to flow in his belly, he stopped dead in his tracks. A line of smoke materialized before his eyes and transformed into words. You have cultivated the N1 mental technique to the Sanji stage. Talent activated. Mastery and comprehension. The N1 mental technique has reached absolute perfection. The energy deep within him expanded with explosive force. In the blink of an eye, his mind was flooded with a torrent of absolute power. Immediately after, that massive surge of energy, as if suddenly breaking its chains, began to boil with overwhelming violence. And at that very same instant, we see him feel as though all strength were abandoning his body. His blood and vital energy had been drained in a single second. If this continued, there was no doubt he would die on the spot. The Sanji stage required refining the blood to generate power, a dangerous process, to be honest. The blood essence. He dragged his feet, which felt incredibly heavy. Like lead, he rummaged desperately in the secret floor compartment until he pulled out that crimson, fleshy sphere. Chun had told him that blood essence was the pure vital energy of a demon, capable of brutally accelerating cultivation. His progress had been far too rapid, and his body was beginning to collapse. But that stone was the salvation he needed. The energy inside him roared, connecting with the essence. To the naked eye, the bloody sphere began to wither until it vanished, while a torrent of pure vitality restored his lost power. The energy, which had been uncontrollable before, now flowed with a sense of perfection. Absolute perfection. It surged fiercely from his head to every corner of his limbs. It was only when his arms, legs, and chest were flooded with that comforting heat that the storm began to calm. A heavy dizziness took hold of him. His body, as it turned out, was still quite fragile. Despite having used the blood essence, the leap in level had been far too abrupt. Pushing the Anjuan mental technique to its absolute peak with the help of his miraculous gift had demanded a brutal price. Fortunately, thanks to that stone, he managed to survive. And although he was still weak, he knew that time would eventually heal his wounds. He had reached the summit of the Sangway stage, and we see him feel the power flowing. It moved inside him like an unstoppable river, and an intense joy began to fill his chest. He had gambled big and won. This system was, without a doubt, his true secret weapon. What would take a normal warrior years of hellish training to master, he had achieved in a single day. He took his sharp saber and began to channel the Anjuan technique. In an instant, the blade of the weapon was covered in a layer of freezing frost. Even the temperature of the room plummeted several degrees, a chilling display of power, to be honest. With that icy power in his hands, he had finally left simple mortals behind. He put his weapon away, forcing himself to stifle the rising euphoria. The world was full of monsters and invincible masters, after all. He couldn't afford to lose his sanity. His next step would be to unlock a new class. And meanwhile, he would wait for Chun to return to question him about the stage following the Sangway. Furthermore, there was the matter of the blood essence. That was truly an invaluable treasure, and if the opportunity arose, he knew he had to hunt for a few more. His mind mapped out the plan immediately, as the new class was non-negotiable. It was the pillar of his survival, and the information Chun held was absolutely vital. As for the demonic power, after tasting its sweet poison tonight, it was evident he would be going back for more. The only question remaining now was, which new class should he choose? He thought carefully about his own life and his next move, knowing he couldn't choose a class lightly. A single mistake would mean wasting time that he simply did not have. Just as he was turning the matter over in his mind, the sound of footsteps broke the silence of the street. It was Chun's voice calling out, asking him to open the door because he needed to talk. In the depth of the night, bathed in moonlight, his voice sounded broken, almost breathless, to be honest. Inan frowned and approached the entrance, gripping his weapon tightly. He wondered what on earth had happened, as there was a trace of panic in the man's tone that he didn't like at all. We see him standing in the center of a hurricane, having only recently torn apart one of the Ideo sect men. Any unforeseen event demanded extreme caution, and Chun responded with a sense of urgency. He explained he had been wounded during an investigation and begged to be let inside. He claimed to have vital information, and though Inan hesitated, he finally raised his saber to lift the latch from a safe distance. He told him to push, and by the time he finished speaking, he had already backed away several steps, staying on guard. The old wooden door creaked like a crow's lament, and Chun came staggering in. His face was as pale as death, and he slammed the door behind him while the hand holding his weapon trembled uncontrollably. In the dim light of the lamp, the dried blood on his short sword gleamed with a dark crimson hue. Noticing the enormous distance Inan had kept, his mustache twitched as he managed a bitter smile. He remarked on how cautious Inan was, knowing perfectly well why he acted that way, and he didn't blame him. Without lowering his guard, Inan asked him what exactly had happened. Chun let out a dismal laugh and replied that the pig demon had finally lost his mind. He slaughtered the entire village of Jingi, and now he demands the magistrate hand over the bastard who killed his offspring. I went to investigate and discovered the corpses of several guards who had gone there to negotiate. The cursed monster caught my scent. I managed to kill a couple of the young ones and escape, but I barely made it out alive. Recalling the hell he had just lived through, Chun wiped the cold sweat from his brow, terror still reflected in his eyes. Inan responded in a low, somber voice, questioning the very idea of a negotiation. If they were the ones who killed it themselves, what on earth were they planning to negotiate about? The magistrate's men killed the monster with their own hands, and now that they face its vengeance, they have the nerve to call it a negotiation. Chen Chun shook off the sweat and, with a voice broken by exhaustion, replied that those idiots never imagined they'd face an entire nest, and they certainly didn't expect the alpha male to possess the absolute power of the sandy stage. This time, they had truly run headfirst into a wall of steel, a fatal mistake, to be honest. But regardless of how this ends, he assured Anand that he hadn't returned empty-handed. He asked for a bit of water, having run for his life for hours while wounded and bleeding out. The thirst was consuming him from the inside, so Anand picked up the teapot in silence. He poured a cup and left it on the table, maintaining his distance. He told him to take it himself, and Shin Chun, his left hand trembling uncontrollably, grabbed the small vessel and downed it in one desperate gulp. The man asked if Anand didn't think he was taking this paranoia a bit too far. Anand simply replied that he only had one life, leaving Shin Chun speechless for a moment before he asked if Anand wasn't interested in his discovery. Anand stared at him intently, his eyes cold and calculating. He knew the man would tell him eventually. If he had come all this way at midnight, bleeding and talking so much, there was clearly more to the story. After all, there are things that, no matter how much one asks, are never truly told until the moment is right. And as for what truly needs to be told, well, there is no real need to ask. He could have pressured him all night, but if the man decided to stay silent, he would only be wasting his breath, which, to be honest, was a waste of time. Shin Chun scratched his head, completely defeated by that simple logic. The Demon Alpha had confessed that the magistrate's office had made a secret deal with the Fei Yun Gorge. They had slaughtered the young creature specifically to fulfill an order for them. But since they lacked the courage to face the Fei Yun Gorge directly, they unleashed all their bloodthirsty fury upon the city guards instead. Intrigued, Anand asked what on earth this Fei Yun Gorge actually was. Shin Chun let out a cold, hollow laugh and explained that in this county, there are 3 great monster factions. First, the macaque demons, who apparently enjoy devouring human brains. Then the serpents, who feed upon our very purity. And finally, the shadow demons, who take great delight in tearing out our entrails. The Fei Yun Gorge is the absolute territory of those shadow demons. Anand poured himself some water and took a sip with complete and utter indifference. Seeing this, Shin Chun's face twisted into a look of pure disbelief at such a calm reaction. He asked why he had the strange feeling that Anand was listening to a simple bedtime story rather than a death sentence. Anand merely raised an eyebrow, wondering what else the man expected. To him, this was currently nothing more than a tavern ghost story. He had never heard the names of these factions before, let alone seen them with his own eyes. He told him he couldn't take it any other way, then paused, weighing the gravity of the situation in his mind. He then asked if he had secured the evidence, knowing Chen Chun was an undercover agent for the Susia division. And if he had managed to get his hands on such incriminating proof, it was only logical that he was ready to deliver his masterstroke. Chen Chun nodded with a heavy solemnity, confirming that this was indeed the case. He explained that he held the proof in his hands, but for safety, he had divided it into 2 parts. We see him offer one half to Anand, who simply stares back in a deathly silence, completely ignoring the scrap of cloth being held out to him. The man's mustache twitched once more, a small, nervous habit that betrayed his growing anxiety. His cover had been blown to pieces, and he knew that even if that magistrate was just a beast, every monster in this hell hated the Susia division to the death. He was certain they were already plotting how to tear him limb from limb before he could even think of escaping. He planned to leave that very night, figuring that if he were killed, at least the evidence would survive in Anand's hands. He begged his old friend for this one favor, promising that he, too, would find a way to profit from the situation. But Anand didn't move a single muscle. He knew that accepting that cloth meant diving neck-deep into a lake of blood and corruption, and he wasn't ready for someone else's war. After all, his only true purpose, his sacred mandate, if you will, was to keep breathing at any cost. Seeing this stubborn resistance, Chen Chun let out a long, weary sigh of absolute desperation. He looked at Anand and asked if he truly believed he was safe after murdering that creature. In a world like this, as we well know, no secret remains hidden forever. Sooner or later they would find him, and he wondered how on earth Anand expected to survive when that day finally came. It was now an irrefutable fact that the magistrate's office was in bed with the demons. They would never, under any circumstances, allow a loose end like him to remain among the living. They had 1,000 ways to destroy him, but he argued that if Anand helped the Susia division cut out this cancer, he would be protected. These harsh words echoed through Anand's mind, sinking him into a deep sea of troubled contemplation. After a heavy and seemingly endless silence, he finally reached out and took the scrap of cloth. His calculating mind had already analyzed every single variable, and it had finally confirmed the cold, hard truth. The Ding County Magistrate's office and the infernal beasts shared the same bed, and that rotten alliance had already become a consolidated empire. The appearance of someone with Anand's skills in the county was nothing more than a virus in their perfect system of corruption. No matter how fearsome his strength might be, the authorities' first move would always be to annihilate him to maintain their order. And when it came to getting rid of a nuisance, the magistrate had an entire arsenal of dark tactics at his disposal. Was the solution simply to take his saber and massacre them all? A bold thought, certainly, but a dangerous one. It was impossible. However, Chun Shun and his organization represented the resistance, the actual fight against the dark. They were the perfect key to destroying this cage. For if the Su Xie division intervened and purged the city authorities, his safety would be guaranteed forever. Seeing Inan tuck away the incriminating evidence, Chun Shun let out a deep, heavy sigh of relief. He had handed it over because he knew that Inan was no ordinary man. Far from it, in fact. To be honest, in this hell full of traitors, he was the only soul left that Chun Shun could truly trust. He stood up with great difficulty and began to walk toward the exit, dragging his injured leg behind him. Inan asked if he was leaving right that moment, and the man nodded with a bitter expression. He didn't have the luxury of rest, as those monsters were likely already sniffing out his trail. We see Inan watch him lean against the doorframe, telling him in a calm voice that the division demands too high a price in blood. He had always thought that Chun Shun risked his life in an utterly absurd way, and who could blame him for thinking so? His wounds were open and bleeding. Starting a journey to Linzhou in that condition was practically a one-way ticket to the slaughterhouse. Chun Shun stood perfectly still for a second, slowly absorbing the weight of those words. The glint in his eyes turned icy and crystal clear, reflecting a resolve that few men possess. He only needed to survive one more year, and then he could bury his undercover identity forever. If he could just endure this final year, he would cease to be a shadow and officially join the ranks of the Su Xie division. This world is falling to pieces, and true martial arts are almost impossible to find nowadays. The sects guard them jealously, as if they were golden gods hidden away from the common man. And even if you managed to infiltrate one, it would take a lifetime just to earn their trust. He felt he was far too old for those games. He simply didn't have that much time left. The Su Xie division is fair in its own way. If you are willing to bet your life, they give you the power you crave. You gain more strength, and that way, you can keep betting your life just to live one more day. Inan listened to this philosophy in silence, carefully weighing every word the man spoke. Suddenly, Chun Shun flashed a sly, knowing smile. He asked old Ian if he would be interested in joining their ranks. There, he promised, Inan would find all the mental techniques and secrets to doing a proper job. It was the kind of combat his heart truly desired, yet Inan shook his head without a moment's hesitation. For now, he would pass, as the famous division seemed like a story from a very distant land. At this particular moment, his only obsession was simply getting out of this mess alive. The man pulled out an old, worn-out parchment and placed it directly into Inan's hand. Upon receiving it, Inan's eyes immediately locked onto the title written on the cover. In the dim, flickering light of the lamp, he managed to make out the words. The Tiaosin Fist, a hand-to-hand combat manual as lethal as the saber technique he had learned before. Chun Shun stroked his blood-stained mustache and gave him a stern warning. Internal energy techniques are patented by the division, and they do not take theft lightly. If he were to give him one of those, he would essentially be signing Inan's death warrant. But this fist manual, he explained, is something you could find tossed aside in any alleyway in Enzo. He told Inan to consider it a small advance, promising he would be properly rewarded once all of this was over. Inan weighed the book in his hands, feeling a deep sense of mistrust toward the gift. True combat techniques were invaluable jewels, the kind of secrets for which clans would spill rivers of blood. How was it possible, he wondered, for such a relic to be lying around in just any alley? Even if it were only a physical discipline, in the heat of battle, mastering such a technique could mean the difference between victory and death. And yet, deep down, he was certain this man was hiding a trap within his generosity. Chun Shun simply shook his head, as if he were reading Inan's suspicious thoughts in real time. The Tiaosin Fist has an aberrant restrictive condition, something he would understand the moment he glanced at the pages. The very sect that created it was devoured by its own curse, and today, they are nothing more than a ghost in history. But, the man added, if he practiced it even a little, his strength would undoubtedly increase. Inan meditated on those words, not yet bothering to open the book in front of his guest. Without adding another single syllable, Chun Shun turned around and disappeared into the shadows of the street. It was a suicidal journey, but like the loyal undercover hound he was, he couldn't run from his destiny. Once the silhouette was swallowed by the darkness, Inan double-bolted the door and finally opened the manual. Under the dim light of the lamp, and backed by his newly promoted scholar talent, it took him very little time. Just long enough for a stick of incense to burn, he had memorized every last stroke of its pages. When he finished, a single word crossed his mind: garbage. The great restrictive condition of this divine technique was that its power was forged through pure and absurd physical torture. It required channeling energy to crush and refine one's own blood day after day, until pure power concentrated lethally in the fists. The more power you accumulated, the more devastating the technique became, but the cost in time was sheer madness. 30 long years, 30 years of suffering to master, it would grant superhuman, invincible strength at his current cultivation level. But the catch? If he spent those same 30 years training any other technique, he would have already ascended to the next level of power. Cultivating this technique was the equivalent of swallowing poison just for the fun of it, which, naturally, made no sense at all. To hell with this for now. True to his survival instinct, after etching the movements into his brain, he tossed the book into the embers. Only then did he collapse onto the bed, obsessed with the decision of which new class he should awaken next. At the first light of dawn, we see him open his eyes, breaking his meditation and abandoning the lotus position. He had woken up before the sun even tore through the sky, and to make use of the time, he tried to force the Anjuan mental technique once more. He had already reached absolute perfection in the Zhongli stage, but ambition pushed him to try and break his own limits. Last night, Chen-chun's escape had been so frantic that he hadn't even had the chance to ask what the next link in the power chain was. Unfortunately, after forcing the circulation of icy energy dozens of times, his body simply did not respond at all. He realized this technique only served his current level. To ascend and grow stronger, he needed a manual from a higher tier. In an instant, he understood his cruel reality, and with that truth, a genuine sense of frustration set in. If he had obtained his current manual by an absurd stroke of luck, finding one of higher rank in this forgotten town was practically a pipe dream. Those grimoires were priceless treasures, and getting his hands on one would be as difficult as trying to reach the heavens themselves. Seeing that his training was yielding no fruit, he decided that rotting away within four walls wouldn't save his life. Reading 1,000 volumes, he told himself, is not worth as much as traveling 1,000 leagues. Sitting still wouldn't change his destiny. And so, we wonder, has he finally found a new path forward? The awakening. At long last, he has awakened his third class, a moment we have all been waiting for. Now he wanders through the streets, stopping at the stalls, only to shake his head and walk away. A little later, a great commotion in the distance catches our attention. This smithy is a business with history. You cannot offer me so little silver for it. The voice resonates with strength, drawing in a curious crowd. We approach the onlookers. Outside, a bare-chested blacksmith boils with rage, while a middle-aged man dressed in silk responds with total disdain. It may be an old business, but what use is it other than forging scrap metal? I will have to spend a fortune remodeling it. Be grateful I am offering you any money at all. The blacksmith protests in desperation, claiming the iron tools inside are worth a fortune on their own. Even the furnace can be dismantled and sold. Do you take me for an ignorant fool? You are trying to swindle me. The man in silk shakes his sleeve with impatience, a classic sign of a man who knows he's being caught. If you do not want to sell, perfect. I wasn't exactly dying to buy it anyway. He turns and walks away without looking back. The blacksmith doesn't try to stop him. He simply sits at the entrance, lights his pipe, and mutters between puffs. It may be a job of brute force, but I am no idiot. No one will take advantage of me. Seeing that the spectacle has ended, the villagers begin to disperse. Inan places his arm on one of them, asking a question in a firm, steady voice. The man, annoyed by the grip, is about to shout, but upon looking at Inan, a cold shiver runs down his spine. Intimidated, he shrinks back and explains that the blacksmith wants to move to the neighboring county and sell his workshop, but they tried to lowball him. Right now, the man is practically fuming. Inan fixes his gaze on the blacksmith resting at the entrance, lost in his own thoughts. The villager adjusts his collar, mutters about how cold it has suddenly become, and slips away silently the moment Inan is distracted. He rubs his chin, calculating. Hearing the words about brute force, a brilliant idea begins to cross his mind. Physical strength, is that not, in its essence, power in its purest state? We see that he possesses the Mountain Breaker Fist Manual, but it comes with an absolute restriction. It requires colossal strength. The scriptures are quite clear. If someone with innate divine strength cultivates it, they will advance by leaps and bounds. If he manages to raise the blacksmith class to level 3 and obtains a strength-related talent, couldn't he master that martial art? Furthermore, even if it doesn't grant a strength talent, one only needs to look at the blacksmith's imposing musculature. The benefits of mastering this trade would be extraordinary, but as Inan loses himself in calculations, the blacksmith notices the intense stare. Do I have ash on my face or something? He rubs his right cheek, but his hand comes away clean. Inan walks toward him with a firm step and asks directly, "How much are you asking for the smithy?" The blacksmith looks at him in confusion and raises 3 fingers, silently indicating the price. Upon seeing the figure, Inan realizes that it is a true bargain, a steal, to be perfectly honest. He nods without a moment's hesitation. "I'll buy it." The blacksmith stands frozen, as if he had been struck by lightning. "You'll buy it." By this point, the man had already lost all hope of ever selling the place. Although that merchant had been a stingy bastard, his cruel words held a grain of truth. The workshop was packed to the brim with heavy, cumbersome forging tools. Any other buyer would have to spend a small fortune just to empty the building out. And if someone wanted to keep the business running, they would need a level of brute strength that very few possess. Without that physical power, one is simply not fit for this kind of work. And now, here Inan appears out of nowhere, claiming he wants the premises for himself. The blacksmith no longer cared what he would use it for. He just wanted to be rid of it once and for all. Then, Inan breaks the silence. "But I have one condition." The blacksmith blinks, asking with a great deal of caution, "What condition?" As long as it wasn't an insult or a blatant attempt to lower the price, he was willing to accept just about anything. Inan points toward the interior of the workshop and says, I want you to teach me the trade. He explains that he doesn't need any secret techniques. The basics will be more than enough. Upon hearing this, the blacksmith, San, is left even more perplexed than before. Not only does this young man want to buy the premises, but he wants to learn how to forge as well. San observes Inan's build, and to be honest, he doesn't look like someone made for the punishment of heavy labor. As the old saying goes, of the three most cruel labors in this world, there is rowing, forging, and grinding soybeans. Blacksmithing is no child's play, but Inan simply nods firmly and gets straight to the point. He asks if he accepts or not, knowing that to unlock the class, he needs the fundamentals, and a master will speed things up. Deep down, he knows he has no reason to give the man any explanations for his motives. This is a simple business deal. If the man is interested, fine, and if not, he can forget it. The blacksmith meditates on it for a moment and finally lets out a long sigh. All right, he agrees, but I will only teach you for 3 days, then I'm getting out of here. Inan looks at him coldly and simply says, let's go sign the contract. Without another word, the blacksmith accompanies him to formalize the transfer of the property. By the time they finish with all the bureaucratic paperwork, the sun is already marking high noon. After swallowing some food quickly, Inan drags the blacksmith back to the workshop to begin his instruction. It is the first time Sen has ever seen a young man so desperate to sweat in front of an anvil. Knowing that the sooner he finishes, the sooner he can leave, he begins to explain every detail with precision. Inside the furnace, the flames roar with fury, and the heat is absolutely suffocating. The blacksmith, San, gives precise instructions while we see Inan execute every movement with careful deliberation. He tells him to relax his first 2 fingers and maintain a firm grip with the other 3. He must open his grip wide and keep his wrist straight, never letting the weight of the hammer overcome him. By flexing his knees and using the strength of his waist and hips to drive his torso, he can take the strain off his arms. Inan's concentration is absolute. He absorbs every word from the veteran, and his understanding of the forge deepens with every strike. When the afternoon light finally begins to fade, he wipes the sweat from his brow and looks the blacksmith in the eye. He tells the man he can leave tomorrow morning, as he no longer needs to be taught anything else. San is stunned for a moment, unable to fathom how he learned so quickly, but he wasn't about to waste this chance to leave. And so, he gathers his belongings in a hurry and abandons the smithy without a single look back. In that very instant, a line of ethereal text materializes before Inan's eyes. Blacksmith Level 1. Experience, 0 out of 100. The quality of the objects he forges has now increased slightly. With the talent unlocked, he wonders if his scholar class helped, but mastering this trade took only a fraction of the expected time. However, he decides to stop for today, as he has been striking metal all afternoon and the sky is already turning to sunset. If he continues hammering through the night, the neighbors will surely end up cursing his entire lineage for the noise. After a moment's thought, he cleans the workshop, closes the doors, and begins the long walk back home. With this new class secured, he plans to return first thing tomorrow morning to continue perfecting his skills. As he makes his way through the streets, the last rays of the sun disappear completely. Just as he reaches the entrance of his dark alley, the mantle of night has swallowed the city, leaving only the moon's glow. Guided by that pale, silver light, he steps into the deep shadows of the alleyway. He has barely taken a few steps when his nose twitches instinctively. Something is wrong in the air. It smells of blood, and thanks to his time as a butcher, his senses are finely tuned to that unmistakable metallic stench. He doesn't need more than a single second to recognize it. But this is a peaceful alleyway, and we have to wonder why there would be such a thick trail of blood here. Without hesitation, he unsheaths the sharp knife at his waist, silences his footsteps, and moves through the shadows with the precision of a predator. 100 paces further, the door to his house finally appears within his field of vision. However, the grotesque scene unfolding just outside causes him to frown in pure disgust. We see 3 repulsive pig demons crouching on the ground, desperately devouring a pool of human flesh and viscera. And right in the middle of these 3 abominations stands a grotesque boar demon over 3 meters tall, crushing a human bone between its tusks. Its belly is bloated, its black fur is as thick and sharp as steel needles, and fresh blood drips from its hideous maw. Scattered across the ground are shredded pieces of fabric with floral patterns. He recognizes that pattern instantly. It belonged to a sweet girl who lived on this very street. She was a thin young woman with paralyzed legs who made her living weaving in her humble home. Only a few days ago, she had promised to knit him a pair of gloves to protect him from the harsh winter. He lets out a heavy sigh as his gaze turns as cold and hard as ice, and he begins to walk directly toward the beast. Under the thick veil of night, the giant boar demon tosses the bloody femur aside, its eyes glowing with an infernal red light. The 3 smaller demons turn toward him, letting out a low, guttural growl. The beast's murderous aura floods the alley, mixed with a nauseating smell of sulfur and filth. The demon leader clasps its enormous hands in mockery, calming its minions, and speaks to him in a raspy voice. They had waited a long time, and since his boys were starving, they decided to have a little snack while he arrived. It doesn't bother you, does it? Meanwhile, in another part of the city, Captain Sung abruptly halts his pace and frowns. His instincts are screaming at him that something is terribly wrong. The place reeks of fresh blood, and amidst that stench, he detects the unmistakable, rancid trail of the boar demons. If that smell persists, it means the beasts passed through here. But then, where are the bodies? Open that door, Captain Sung orders, drawing his long sword with resolve. In the middle of the street's deadly stillness, Sung takes his guard, ready for any attack. His subordinate swallows hard, his hands visibly trembling as he reaches out to push the old, rotting wooden door. All the guards know perfectly well that when Captain Sung has that look on his face, it means death is lurking on the other side. Forcing the rookie to open the door means that if a beast is waiting, he will be the first victim. But does he have the courage to refuse? Of course not. If he wants to keep wearing the uniform in this county and continue taking advantage of innocent citizens, he must obey his superior without a word. The old wood groans with an unbearable creak as it swings open. As soon as it gives way, the guard stumbles back several steps, his sword trembling pathetically in his hands. Captain Sung spits on the ground with contempt and gives him a sharp smack to the head. You are completely useless. Under the pale beam of moonlight entering through the door, the interior of the house reveals itself. It becomes visible, and we see it is completely deserted. Aside from some broken furniture, there is no trace of life. Where the hell has that butcher gone? Consumed by intrigue, the captain orders 2 of his men to enter and search the area. Minutes later, the guards emerge shaking their heads, indicating there is absolutely nothing out of the ordinary, only a deathly chill. One of the guards rubs his arms for warmth, feeling as if a pair of invisible eyes were stalking him from the shadows. Captain Sung frowns even deeper, analyzing his surroundings with deep suspicion. Let us return to the magistrate's office for now. We will report this anomaly to Lord Darnley. A terrifying theory crosses his mind. Could the boar demon have unleashed a massacre right in this very spot? But he knows all the great warriors of the county better than anyone, and this is just the house of a miserable butcher. Is it possible that this nobody is actually a secret martial arts expert? Impossible. Escorted by his men, the captain abandons the property. The night is thick and silent until, suddenly, the echo of slow, deliberate footsteps resonates with a chilling clarity through the darkness. Hearing the slight crunch, Sung unsheathes his weapon in a fraction of a second, his eyes locking onto the shadows with murderous ferocity. The hand gripping his sword is drenched in cold sweat, a rare sign of nerves for a man like him. Who goes there? He demands, wondering if the beasts have set an ambush for them. This dark alley reeks of death, but Sung has survived countless battles in his youth and knows the scent well. Although years of city corruption have made him lazy, his survival instincts remain intact and activate instantly. The rookies, seized by panic, draw their swords and stumble over one another, buzzing like a swarm of frightened wasps. Then, from the gloom of the alley, the figure of a young man with black hair and a knife hanging at his waist slowly emerges. Captain Sung recognizes him instantly and raises his weapon. Put your hands against the damn wall and don't make any sudden movements. He still remembers the name perfectly. Last time, when no veteran could cut the tough hide of a dead demon, the butcher did it with ease. Without flinching, the young man keeps his hand resting on the hilt of his knife and speaks with a voice of pure ice. I assume you've already seen everything. The moment those words leave his lips, a deathly silence takes hold of the street. In this stillness, if a pin were to drop, it would sound like a clap of thunder. The captain swallows hard, his throat feeling rough and dry as he stares at the butcher. Did you, Inan, really kill the boar demons? His entire being refuses to believe such madness, but seeing the disturbing tranquility on your face, he has no choice but to accept the reality. You nod your head slowly. They came looking for trouble, so you slaughtered them to avoid wasting any more time. We see that you had just returned from your arduous training at the blacksmith shop, crossing paths with the captain's patrol just in time. Faced with his interrogation, he makes the decision to confess to the butchery. Hiding it at this point would be a completely useless exercise, to be honest. Besides, deep down, he feels this revelation fits perfectly with his long-term plans. He knows he is walking on thin ice. The real threat is no longer coming from the beasts themselves. Just as old Chin Chun warned him, the High Command is secretly colluding with the demons and would never tolerate an unknown variable threatening their power in the county. And he, without a shadow of a doubt, is that dangerous variable. It was inevitable that his strength would come to light. After all, there is no secret the wind cannot eventually scatter. Now that the curtain has fallen, he is left with only 2 paths to choose from. The first is to feign ignorance, but even a blind man would notice the lie, and knowing Lord Darnley's paranoid nature, he wouldn't rest until he cornered him with traps. The second option is to embrace the truth and put his true power on full display. In this empire, absolute strength is the only thing that truly matters, isn't it? He is a monster hunter, not a common war criminal. As long as he possesses the power to crush skulls, what does it matter what that desk-bound bureaucrat tries to do? Of course, he is well aware that this reckless strategy has an expiration date. After all, Lord Darnley will not allow a stray dog to jeopardize his dominion for very long. But buying time is his highest priority now. He only needs to prolong this truce, and thanks to his system, he will become so powerful the whole city will bow at his feet. By then, that cursed bureaucrat will tremble at the mere mention of his name. He only requires a couple of days, the exact amount of time needed to perfect the talents of his new blacksmith class. However, Captain Sung raises his sword, threatening Inan with a display of false bravery. He tells him that his story is very pretty, but he doesn't believe a single word of it. He demands that Inan surrender his weapons and accompany them to the tribunal immediately. There are too many mysteries in this story, he claims. Deep down, the captain simply doesn't dare to make a decision on his own. He only wants to use Lord Dinley as a shield. Inan looks at him with total disdain and sighs coldly. He tells the captain that he clearly doesn't understand his own pathetic situation, leaving the man petrified. In the blink of an eye, a silver flash illuminates the night. With a bone-chilling sound that tears through the wind itself, Sung watches in terror as Inan's knife blade stops millimeters from his eyes, his body unable to react. Cold sweat soaks the soldier's forehead. He knows perfectly well that if that strike had been aimed at his throat, his head would already be rolling on the pavement. His speed is monstrous. How is it possible for a simple butcher to possess such a high level of combat skill? The captain asks if he truly plans to rebel against the laws of the empire. Sung stammers the question while backing away in terror, his voice breaking pathetically. Inan looks him straight in the eye and responds with implacable serenity. He reminds him that he only slaughtered the monsters that were terrorizing these very streets. He asks what crime he has committed, exactly. That simple, blunt question drains all the color from the captain's face, leaving him pale as a corpse. Inan was right, of course. Annihilating demons would never be considered a crime. Would the captain really dare to contradict martial law? In the entire vast empire, wiping out a plague of beasts is not only legal, but the sacred order of demon hunters would likely reward him with honors. Captain Sung swallows the lump in his throat and finally sheaths his sword. The veteran officer did not dare to refute a single one of his words. On one hand, his logic was completely unshakable, which, to be honest, was hard to argue with. But above all, the absolute terror he felt toward Inan's power had him completely paralyzed. His best years were long behind him, and he no longer possessed the warrior spirit of his youth. His only desire was